Keith Stein. I'm one of the original authors, co-authors of Disposable Heroes and Coffin for Seven Brothers. I'm the author of Disposable Heroes 2, and I also wrote the original This Very Ground, and I'm also the author of this new version of This Very Ground, Victory or Death. Well, I started in 2001. I was in college, and I met Chalfont Conley, co-author of Disposable Heroes. And I had been tinkering with World War II rules writing. I basically took 3rd edition 40K, and for my own use, I just kind of copied and pasted it and created a World War II set just to be able to screw around with World War II. And I was just getting into World War II miniatures, and then from that point on, we had Iron Ivan Games up until 2017. So what, almost 20 years now, 19 years. Well, I was just doing a count in my head, and if you count published rule systems, I have 5 rule systems that I either authored or co-authored. And unofficially, for my own personal use, I have 2 rule sets. One is a modification of another rule set. But, yeah. And I have under my belt, I guess, I think 6 different supplements, army books, that kind of thing, that I'm author of or co-author of. So.
Cool.
Victory or Death, This Very Ground Victory or Death, is a platoon-based game, 1-to-1 scale. So each model represents 1 soldier. And it's kind of platoon level where a unit which is a generic description, a unit is basically like a platoon, 10 to 15 models. You can go as high as 25 or more, but it's really designed for units of about 10 models. And then each side will have maybe 4 or 5 units, and then you're gonna have 1 or 2 officers. So that's about the scope of it. It's meant to represent small unit skirmish. It's not a skirmish game where you're moving individual models. The focus is on actual units. So you're moving units around the table and they're firing, and then officers are kind of getting the units to move and rally them and those kinds of things. So it's not a granular 1-to-1 scale, individual combatants skirmish. It's definitely small unit skirmish. But it doesn't get into the bigger scope where you're not moving battalions around and there's not a more than 1-to-1 scale figure ratio. So. Okay. This Very Ground Victory or Death is focused on officers that are there to get your units moving and to keep them in line. So it relies on having officers around to make sure that you can accomplish your tactical goals by moving units forward. Once the shooting starts, then it can kind of get interesting tactically, because units will fight on their own, but to get the whole army to kind of do coordinated things, you need an officer. So that's one of the things that brings the warfare of the period into play. Units will defend themselves and they'll shoot at other enemies, but officers are really there to move the whole army around, and to rally troops and rally broken units and that kind of thing. Also, the firing mechanics allow for the units to move and shoot and also try to reload without having to worry about counting individual models or keeping track of which model is loaded and which model isn't. It's really designed to give that period feel of units firing by platoon. Some guys are going to be firing, some guys are going to be reloading, but it also gives the scope of infantry tactics where a unit can volley as their initial opening volley, and that gives more firepower to you. After that, you're going to have some guys that are going to have their muskets unloaded and others that aren't. But it does that very smoothly. You keep track of firepower with smoke counters, which are in front of the unit, and the amount of firepower they're putting out and is based on how many smoke counters they have out. So it's really brings that into play without being tedious record keeping. So I think that's one of the key components. One of my favorite aspects of it is, I was reading a lot more about this when I was getting ready to write This Very Ground, the new version. I was reading a lot about how bayonet charges very rarely made contact, and I was trying to bring that aspect of it where units would come into close proximity and engage in a firefight, and then the unit that won the combat was the one that was able to build up for a charge, which drove the enemy off. So in this version of the rules, bayonet charges are going to be something where the unit that is going to charge is going to use their valor score to kind of engage in the charge, and that is going to determine how many of the enemy unit are going to, disengage or flee. And so a lot of times you'll have a unit that gets off a charge will move forward, and the other unit will kind of fall back away from that charge. So you'll very rarely have charges make contact. It's going to be more that push and pull from that period, except for natives. Native units are going to be more prone to get into close combat, and they have rules that actually kind of flip that, where they will charge in first and be able to get into melee more effectively than bayonet. They don't use the bayonet charge rules. So it's going to be a little bit of that subtlety and back and forth of bayonet charges are good for your European type units. Natives are going to use the terrain to move through and then get into those, in the melee contact, and that's using their tactics. Well, I was just thinking about this, and it's actually, this was a tough one for me, only because I've written both, and they're actually separated by so many years. I wrote the original This Fairground in 2005, and it wasn't until this year that I started writing this one, and it took me about a year. Well, not this year, the year before. It took me about a year to write it. And there are a lot of differences. The first This Very Ground was a mess as far as layout and trying to find things, and the way it was organized was a mess. And I think this clears a lot of that up. This makes melee and charges and that whole thing a lot easier. And the fire mechanics are very similar. If you like, and it's one of my favorite things from the first edition, and I kind of wanted to keep. But once I started writing the system, I found out I really kind of couldn't keep them completely intact. But the way that I use the rules for command points, which is similar to Disposable Heroes 2, so if you've played that, then this will be familiar to This Very Ground. I kind of ported that over from Disposable Heroes 2 with the command points and the activations and that kind of stuff. So firing is very similar in that it flows really easily like the first one, I think, keeping track of smoke counters and things. But it's a little more subtle, and that allows you to reload and move and shoot more naturally, I think. So I think if you like the fire mechanics from the first one, you'll still like this one because it keeps that spirit of that. But I think it's, it ports it over into this new kind of activation system. The command and control rules, I think, are better. The first one didn't really have officers playing a major role. Units kind of did their own thing, and it was kind of disjointed. And this, officers play a much bigger role. So that's something that if you are familiar with the first edition, that is a whole new thing. And the way that an officer can actually, one of the rules that they can do is they can move multiple units by issuing, an advance the line. So you can have multiple units advancing. In the first edition, you had to activate one unit they could move. The next activation, you activate another unit, and it didn't really allow you to pull off plan. This allows you to advance the whole line. And then now, once a unit gets disrupted, that's going to break up the line, and terrain will break up the line. So it's not always going to work, but when you have the right terrain conditions and the officers in the right positions, it allows you to move, your whole army. And I think that's something that wasn't in the first that I really think people will like in this version. Let's see, the morale rules are very similar to the first edition because they're also very similar to Disposable Heroes 2. So there's not a whole lot of changes with that. So other than that, I think those are the major changes. Oh, forgot to mention, with the new edition of This Very Ground, Victory or Death, it doesn't just focus on the French and Indian War. It actually goes all the way from King Philip's War all the way through the War of 1812. And it includes a scenario for King Philip's War, for the French and Indian War, for the AWI, and for the War of 1812. So this will give, and the lists allow you to create units from pretty much any unit from all of these wars. King Philip's War, the scenario is a little bit smaller because it's less combatants and less troops involved, all the way up through War of 1812, which you can have more units on the table than you would French Indian War or anything like that. So, so that's a big change. Lon kind of twisted my arm and made me expand the scope to pretty much all the wars, black powder wars in North America that Americans know. So, there you go. And I think you're going to love Paul Hicks's miniatures. So, I mean, his work is amazing. I hope my rules will allow you to take full advantage of his wonderful miniatures and sculpting. I think you'll like it. If you like the first edition, I think you'll like this one. So I thank you so much for supporting the Kickstarter.